Welcome to the debate. Today, we're digging into something absolutely fundamental to English, but often, kind of overlooked in its complexity. Prepositions. Those little words in, on, at, under, over. They're like the nuts and bolts holding our sentences together, and they really profoundly shape clarity and meaning.
Absolutely. They seem simple, but mastering them is a whole different story, especially for language learners. Which brings us to our central question today. What's the most effective way for non-native speakers to get a real handle on English prepositions? Is it primarily through, explicit grammar study, learning the rules, memorizing lists?
Or is it better achieved implicitly through just massive exposure, absorbing the language in context, kind of like how native speakers seem to do it without thinking? Our discussion is going to draw on quite a bit of linguistic thinking, looking at lists, how native speakers acquire them, and the frankly common struggles learners face.
Right. And for today's discussion, I'll be arguing that this implicit acquisition, learning through natural immersion and context, is really the key, especially for the tricky idiomatic uses.
And I'll be taking the position that for adult learners particularly, a structured, explicit approach focusing on rules, categories, and memorization is actually essential to navigate this really complex system and achieve real accuracy.
Okay, so let's lay out our opening thoughts.
All right, from my perspective, look, English prepositions are just notoriously challenging. Even advanced speakers trip up on them constantly. We've all seen it, right? Students master complex tenses, but still say arrive to the city instead of arrive in. Our source material points out there are over 250 common prepositions. That's a huge number. Trying to just absorb that amount implicitly feels, inefficient at best. That's why I argue a systematic, explicit approach is necessary. We do have clear categories, prepositions of place, time, direction, and they often follow definable rules. Think about it. In for larger time periods like months, years, seasons, or for being inside something in July, in 2025, in the box. Then you have at for precise times or specific points, at 3 p.m., at the bus stop, and on for days, dates, surfaces, on Friday, on the desk. These patterns are teachable, learnable, and explicit study directly targets those really common errors learners make, like saying at Monday, which we know should be on Monday. Or dropping prepositions entirely, like I listen music instead of I listen to music. And what about incorrect pairings? Interested about instead of interested in, or depend from instead of depend on. These are classic mistakes.
Okay, but those pairings...
And even complex prepositions, multi-word ones like in spite of, due to, on behalf of, they function like vocabulary units with specific meanings that absolutely benefit from being explicitly taught and learned. Consulting dictionaries, reviewing lists, memorizing those verb preposition combinations. These are proven methods, and the data backs us up. Research cited in our material highlights that preposition errors make up a huge chunk, sometimes nearly 30% of grammatical mistakes for non-native writers. So for accuracy, especially in academic or professional contexts, explicit study isn't just helpful, I'd argue it's essential. It gives learners a conscious framework to build upon.
Okay, I see the appeal of structure. I really do. But I come at this from a different angle. While those rules might seem neat on paper, I believe that prepositions, especially when you get into phrasal verbs and idioms, are fundamentally acquired implicitly. Think about native speakers. We don't sit down with rule books for prepositions as kids, do we? We acquire language. We're surrounded by it. We hear patterns. We subconsciously analyze it. And we build this intuitive grammar. We just know look up a word sounds right and look at a word means something different, usually without ever being taught an explicit rule for it.
But learners aren't children acquiring their first language.
Exactly. But the nature of many prepositions lends itself to that kind of learning. The real headache for learners, the thing that causes so many errors, is that prepositions often fuse with verbs or nouns to create entirely new meanings in phrasal verbs or idioms. Their meaning isn't independent anymore. Take your example, interested in. How does the core meaning of in as inside help there? It doesn't really. Or put up with someone. Where does tolerate come from put plus up plus with? It doesn't. These are chunks, lexical units. You learn them like vocabulary, often through context and repetition.
And that's where this idea of the rhythm of prepositions comes in. It's that feel that cadence native speakers have, knowing instinctively which preposition fits. It's learned by hearing it, by imitation, not by reciting rules. That's also why direct translation is such a minefield. English prepositions often don't map neatly onto other languages precisely because their meaning is so contextual and frequently non-literal. Our source material even admits, quote, there are hardly any rules as to when to use which preposition. It points out at can have 10 dictionary meanings. Or think about in the morning versus on Friday morning. The logic gets slippery very quickly. So for me, this deep idiomaticity, this contextual dependency, argues strongly against relying primarily on explicit rules. It suggests immersion and exposure are far more critical for developing that intuitive grasp.
Okay, you've raised some important points about idioms and native acquisition, but let's drill down on the meaning itself. I still contend that many prepositions do have core categorical meanings that form a logical foundation. Yes, idioms exist, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The source material itself gives us definitions. In means inside or encapsulated by. At means a particular point. On means on the surface. These aren't just random associations. They reflect spatial or temporal logic. Think about over. It pretty consistently means above, covering, or across. Fly over the house, a blanket over the baby, walk over the bridge. These aren't obscure idioms. They're direct applications of a core spatial concept. Learning these categories provides a vital scaffold. It gives learners a starting point, a way to organize the chaos before they tackle the truly idiomatic stuff.
Without that basic map, how do they even begin to navigate?
I understand the desire for that map, that logical scaffold. And yes, for basic spatial or temporal relations, maybe it holds up. To a point. But my concern is that this core meaning framework starts to break down really quickly when you encounter the sheer volume of usage that doesn't neatly fit. The exceptions, the idioms, the phrasal verbs, they aren't just edge cases. They feel like the main event a lot of the time for learners struggling with fluency. You mentioned fly over the house. Okay, clear spatial meaning. But what about get over an illness, or talk over a problem, or it's over? The connection to the core spatial meaning becomes metaphorical at best, often completely opaque. Take run into someone, meaning meet unexpectedly. How does the core meaning of into help you decipher that? Or catch up on work. The preposition's meaning is completely transformed by the verb it attaches to. it becomes part of a larger chunk.
My argument is that focusing too much on finding the core logic can actually be misleading. Learners are often better served recognizing these phrasal units, run into, catch up on, get over, as individual items to be learned in context, rather than trying to dissect them based on a supposed core meaning of into, on, or over. The idiomatic usage often overshadows the literal.
Okay, the prevalence of idioms is undeniable. But let's shift focus slightly to the practical side for learners. Let's talk about effectiveness, especially considering those error rates we mentioned. Our sources show non-native speakers struggle immensely, with prepositions causing up to 29% of grammatical errors in one study, appearing incorrectly in nearly 1 in 5 sentences in another. That's a massive hurdle to clear communication.
It is. No argument there.
So my point is, explicit, structured learning is a direct, necessary response to that specific problem. The advice is clear. Study and understand correct usage. Consult a good dictionary. Memorize lists of dependent prepositions. This isn't just busy work. It's targeted practice to combat those very errors. It builds conscious awareness. Knowing you need to say apologize for, not apologize about, or consist of, not consist in, that comes from focused study from most learners. It might not grant instant native intuition, sure, but it demonstrably reduces errors, builds confidence, and provides a foundation for more accurate communication, especially where precision really matters, like academic writing or professional emails. Without that conscious, targeted effort, how do learners systematically climb out of that high error rate? Just hope for the best through exposure alone?
See, those high error rates, to me, don't automatically prove that explicit rule memorization is the most effective path. They highlight the difficulty, absolutely, but they might also signal the limitations of a rule-first approach when dealing with something so vast and, well, fluid. You mentioned the list of 257 prepositions. Trying to consciously learn and apply rules for all of those, plus their multiple meanings, plus their idiomatic uses, it's overwhelming, frankly. Maybe the errors persist because the rule system being taught doesn't adequately capture the reality of usage. Think about how native speakers acquire it. Subconscious absorption, learning by analogy. Our source material itself stresses that a firm grasp comes only by exposure to the language in natural contexts, and warns that learning prepositions in isolation can be challenging. Perhaps the focus should be less on memorizing rules in a vacuum, and more on strategies for noticing patterns within authentic input. The explicit knowledge might be a byproduct of extensive exposure rather than the primary driver. It's like learning to swim. You need to be in the water experiencing it, not just reading the manual on fluid dynamics. The errors might stem from trying to apply rigid rules to something that requires more of an intuitive feel, a feel that only comes from that deep immersion.
Okay, I absolutely agree. Context and exposure are vital. Nobody masters a language just from a grammar book. But I see the role of context differently for a learner compared to a native speaker. For the learner, context helps refine and apply the rules or categories they've already consciously learned. It doesn't replace the need for that initial structure. Take those dialect differences on the weekend versus at the weekend. A learner who understands the general rules for time prepositions has a framework to understand this isn't random chaos. It's a systematic variation. They can then adapt. Without that explicit foundation, they might just get confused or fall back on translating directly from their first language, which we know is often a recipe for error with prepositions. That explicit awareness acts as a cognitive anchor. It prevents those initial, often hard to shake transfer errors. It gives them something concrete to work with as they encounter new examples in context. It's about empowering the learner to actively use the context to test and refine their understanding, not just passively wait for intuition to strike.
But I think you're potentially underestimating what's happening during that passive acquisition. It's not just about soaking up examples. It's about internalizing something deeper. Native speakers, as one source puts it, learn the rhythm of the language and absorb a certain way of thinking about direction, motion, and shapes. This isn't about conscious rules. It's about developing these ingrained habits of thought. It's a subconscious, intuitive understanding of how English carves up the world spatially and temporally. Why do we say look up a word, but look after a child? It's not a simple rule application. It's tapping into these deep-seated conceptual metaphors and patterns embedded in the language.
Or understanding a new phrase like toggle in by analogy with type in, even if it's not in any rule book. That ability comes from having internalized the underlying logic, not explicit rules, but the language's inherent conceptual system through massive exposure.
That deep, almost unconscious grasp is what allows for truly authentic, flexible use. And I just don't think you can replicate that primarily through explicit rule learning. It requires that rich, extensive engagement where you absorb the system implicitly.
So to bring my perspective together, I maintain that for adult language learners navigating this complex system, a systematic, explicit approach is indispensable. Studying the categories, learning the common rules, memorizing fixed phrases and dependent prepositions, this provides a crucial foundation. Yes, exposure is vital for fluency and nuance, but this targeted learning directly tackles the high rate of errors learners typically make. It builds a conscious understanding, fosters accuracy, and ultimately increases confidence, particularly when clear communication is essential. For me, it remains the most reliable pathway for learners aiming for precision.
And I'd circle back to the idea that the heart of preposition usage, especially the idiomatic and phrasal aspects, is best captured through extensive natural exposure, mirroring native acquisition. Understanding prepositions as parts of larger chunks, internalizing that linguistic rhythm, absorbing those habits of thought, these are key. Overemphasizing explicit rules risks missing the fluid, contextual, and often non-literal nature of how these words truly function. While structure has its place, true mastery, that intuitive feel for the language, stems primarily from deep immersion and contextual learning. The challenge, really, is finding the right blend.
It certainly highlights the complexity, doesn't it? This discussion really underscores that while that systematic study provides a necessary framework,
the profoundly embedded idiomatic nature of so many prepositions means that rich contextual exposure is just as critical, perhaps even more so, for developing that genuine native-like intuition. It leaves us all, I think, to reflect on how best to balance these approaches in any language learning journey.